So imagine you've stepped into a place where legends have played and generations of fans have cheered and suffered together. That place is Wrigley Field.
That's a well-hit ball, deep to left. Back. Hey! Attaboy, Ernie!
But Wrigley Field is more than just a baseball stadium. It's a historic landmark that has shaped the legacy of the game of baseball. So, early on, kind of the birth of Wrigley Field here. Originally, it was called Wigman Park, and it was made for the Chicago Whales of the Federal League. And the Chicago Whales were not a great baseball team in their league. Compared to their competition, they really didn't win much, I guess you could say. And at the time, a lot of Federal League teams were being bought out by American League and National League owners. At the time, the American League and National League were two separate leagues. Eventually, they combined, and now today they're the MLB, Major League Baseball. They're still the American League and National League, but those are together now. And so, yeah, the Whales were not very successful, and they were bought out by the Chicago Cubs. And the Cubs moved in to Wigman Park in 1916. And in 1927, they renamed it to Wrigley Field after William Wrigley Jr., who was he owned a gum company. So if you like to chew gum, you've maybe heard of Wrigley's. And William Wrigley Jr. was the man behind that. All right, so some of the iconic features at Wrigley Field. Starting it off with the ivy out in the outfield wall. And this is probably the most unique feature that Wrigley Field has to offer in comparison to other MLB stadiums. It's really interesting to watch games here because a lot of times balls get hit out there and they get stuck in the ivy, and players have to dig them out and stuff like that. And so it's just really kind of interesting to watch. The ivy was planted in 1937. And obviously it has to grow every season, so early on in the season it doesn't come in yet, and it kind of just looks bare bones. But towards the summer and the fall, it starts to grow in, and really it's cool to see. This scoreboard here, so Wrigley Field is one of only two stadiums, MLB stadiums, that use manually operated scoreboards. There are digital scoreboards throughout the stadium, but Wrigley Field and Fenway Park, which is where the Boston Red Sox play, are the only two stadiums to use these manually operated scoreboards. And so, yeah, they show scores from obviously the Cubs game that's going on, but also scores from around the league. And yeah, it's really kind of cool. You have to pull back and I guess place a number in there. It's kind of hard to explain, but it's really cool, and it really makes Wrigley Field stand out. And then last thing here is the lights. So Wrigley Field was actually the last Major League Baseball stadium to install lights. And they were kind of forced to install lights. In 1945, they hosted the World Series at Wrigley Field. And at the time, the World Series games were played during the day, so it wasn't much of an issue. But years later, the MLB said that Wrigley Field, if they didn't get lights, they weren't going to be able to host World Series games because the games had been starting to be played at night. And so the first night game played at Wrigley Field was August 8th, 1988. And the World Series thing never ended up being an issue because the Cubs never made the World Series in that time period. They actually didn't make the World Series for another about 30 years until 2016. So that was never much of an issue. And then last thing is kind of some historic moments and iconic players that have played at Wrigley Field. So like I mentioned a minute ago, Wrigley Field hosted the 1945 and 2016 World Series. In 1945, the Cubs lost in the World Series to the Detroit Tigers. And in 2016, they lost, or excuse me, they won the World Series. Games number 3, 4, and 5 were played at Wrigley Field. However, the Cubs did not win the World Series at Wrigley Field. They won it on the road in Cleveland. So, however, the 2016 World Series was the first time it had been played there in almost, or over 50 years. So, and then obviously famous baseball legends have played there. Ernie Banks, Ryne Sandberg. In the late 1990s, you had the home run chase between Sammy Sosa and Mark McGwire. So that kind of really boosted baseball's popularity back up from where it was. And then in this picture here, you see a fan reaching over the wall and interfering with the Cubs left fielder. This is kind of a famous moment from Wrigley Field because they were on a really long championship route. And this catch would have sent them to, or got them out of the inning. But the fan ended up reaching over the wall and making it so the left fielder couldn't catch it. And at the time, it didn't seem like a big deal because it was just a foul ball, but the Marlins, who the Cubs were playing, ended up scoring runs that inning, and they eventually made it to the World Series and won the World Series that year in 2003. So yeah, that's just kind of a famous moment there, kind of a bad moment for Cubs fans, but so, Wrigley Field, not just a baseball stadium, it is a historic landmark that has shaped the legacy of the game of baseball. Thank you.